Hello and welcome back to class. This is Applied Anatomy and Physiology, AAP 301 or 302. This is the College of Natural Health Sciences, Bermuda, and my name is Dr. Dalcina Bean Burrows, where today we will be looking at neuroanatomy for lecture number 20. In terms of today's lecture objectives for lecture number 20, at the end of today's lecture, students will become familiar with the anatomical structures of the brain, become familiar with the functions associated with the lobes of the brain, and understand how damage to specific areas of the brain impacts function. Now, we did have our lecture earlier regarding the central nervous system, and we did look at the brain, but this lecture is specifically so that we could look even more closely at the brain and the brain's function. We begin today's lecture by discussing the brain. The brain directs our body's internal functions. It also integrates sensory impulses and information to form perceptions, thoughts, and memories. The brain gives us self-awareness and the ability to speak and move in the world. Its four major regions make this possible. The cerebrum, with its cerebral cortex, gives us conscious control of our actions. The diencephalon mediates sensations and manages emotions and commands whole internal systems. The cerebellum adjusts body movements, speech coordination, and balance, while the brain stem relays signals from the spinal cord and directs basic internal functions and reflexes. And of course, we see illustrated the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So let's discuss the seat of consciousness, the high intellectual functions that occur in the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest brain structure and part of the forebrain or proencephalon. Its prominent outer portion, the cerebral cortex, not only processes sensory and motor information, but enables consciousness, our ability to consider ourselves and the outside world. It is what most people think of when they hear the term gray matter. The cortex tissue consists mainly of neuron cell bodies, and its folds and fissures, known as gyri and sulci, give the cerebrum its trademark rumpled surface. The cerebral cortex has a left and right hemisphere. Each hemisphere can be divided into four lobes: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. The lobes are functional segments. They specialize in various areas of thought and memory, of planning and decision making, and of speech and sense perception. Let's talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum fine-tunes the body movements and maintains balance. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. It sits below the posterior occipital lobes of the cerebrum and behind the brain stem as part of the hindbrain. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has left and right hemispheres. A middle region, the vermis, connects them, and within the interior tissue rises a central white stem called the arbor vitae because it spreads branches and subbranches through the hemispheres. The primary function of the cerebellum is to maintain posture and balance. When we jump to the side, reach forward, or turn suddenly, it subconsciously evaluates each movement. The cerebellum then sends signals to the cerebrum indicating muscle movements that will adjust our position to keep us steady. Now let's talk about the brainstem. The brainstem relays signals between the brain and spinal cord and manages basic involuntary functions. The brainstem connects the spinal cord to the higher thinking centers of the brain. It consists of three structures: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord and connects to the pons above. Both the medulla and the pons are considered part of the hindbrain. The midbrain or mesencephalon connects the pons to the diencephalon and forebrain. Besides relaying sensory and motor signals, the structures of the brain stem direct involuntary functions. The pons helps control breathing rhythms. The medulla handles respiration, digestion, and circulation, and reflexes such as swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. The midbrain contributes to motor control, vision, and hearing, as well as vision and hearing related reflexes. Now let's discuss the thalamus. The thalamus is referred to as a sorting station, which mediates sensory data and relays signals to the conscious brain. The diencephalon is a region of the forebrain connected to both the midbrain, part of the brain stem, and the cerebrum. The thalamus forms most of the diencephalon. It consists of two symmetrical egg-shaped masses with neurons that mediate out through the cerebral cortex. Sensory data floods into the thalamus from the brain stem, along with emotional, visceral, and other information from different areas of the brain. The thalamus relays these messages to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. It determines which signals require conscious awareness and which should be available for learning and memory. The hypothalamus, we will discuss that next. And the hypothalamus manages sensory impulses, it controls emotions, and regulates internal functions. The hypothalamus is part of the diencephalon, a region of the forebrain that connects the midbrain and the cerebrum. The hypothalamus helps to process sensory impulses of smell, taste, and vision. It manages emotions such as pain and pleasure, aggression, and amusement. The hypothalamus is also our visceral control center, regulating the endocrine system and internal functions that sustain the body day to day. It translates nervous system signals into activating or inhibiting hormones that it sends to the pituitary gland. These hormones can activate or inhibit the release of pituitary hormones that target specific glands and tissues in the body. Meanwhile, the hypothalamus manages the autonomic nervous system devoted to involuntary internal functions. It signals sleep cycles and other circadian rhythms, regulates food consumption, and monitors and adjusts body chemistry and temperature. Now let's discuss the cerebral arterial circle, the circle of Willis. Okay, so we peel back the cover of the computer, aka everything on the outside, and begin our descent. Blood supply to the body's organs is obviously important, but blood supply to the brain is super important. Think of it as plugging into your laptop. You need a continuous power source to keep everything running. Numerous branches of the circle of Willis, the cerebral arterial circle, distribute blood throughout the brain and provide collateral circulation. The thick blue structure that rests above the two brain hemispheres is the superior sagittal sinus, which drains blood from the brain. Now let's consider the functions of the four lobes of the brain. The brain has two hemispheres. The largest part of the brain, what most people visualize when they think of the brain, is the cerebrum. In the image here, the highlighted sections of the four main lobes of the cerebrum, which are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe, are each named for the bones with which they correspond. The frontal lobe is the most anterior of the four, and it is responsible for functions including speech, long-term memory, and decision-making. The parietal lobe integrates sensory information and plays a role in spatial perception. It processes awareness of the body's motion, touch, perception of pain, and temperature. The temporal lobe contains an auditory cortex that receives input from the cochlear nerve and association areas that integrate auditory, olfactory, and complex pattern perception. The occipital lobe is the most posterior of the four, and its functions include receiving input from the eye and processing visual perceptions. Now let's discuss the functions of the hindbrain. Most people, when they picture the brain, only think of the cerebrum, but there's much more to it than that. The hindbrain, or rhombencephalon, is a large structure in the posterior region of the brain, and it is inferior to the occipital lobe. It consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum. The cerebellum fine-tunes body movement and manages balance and posture. The medulla oblongata, which is just fun to say, well, depending on who you talk to, acts as the conduction pathway between the spinal cord and the brain as it controls involuntary functions of the respiratory, digestive, and circulatory systems and contributes to hearing, balance, and taste. The pons bridges the two main function areas of the central nervous system, the higher brain centers, and the spinal cord. Now let's discuss the functions of the limbic system. The limbic system is made up of a number of structures that manage a range of emotions and contribute to the processing of memory and smell. And we're going to talk a lot more about the limbic system when we study our aromatherapy. For those of you who are doing the naturopathic programs, we're going to talk a lot more about the limbic system. The hippocampus, one of the most recognizable structures of the limbic system, is made up of mostly gray matter and plays a role in the consolidation of long-term memory. Now let's consider the functions of the midbrain. The midbrain, one of the main areas of the brain, is involved with vision, hearing, motor control, and thermal regulation. The brain is indeed a most fascinating organ. Based on what we've considered today, it is not hard to understand why damage to any part of the brain will be life-changing in so many ways. Okay, so we have reached the end of today's very short lecture. And for assignment number 20, I'd like for you to answer the following questions. Number 1, what are the lobes of the brain and what are their functions? Number 2, a client comes to you for his regularly scheduled treatment and tells you that he has been having trouble walking and that he is falling down constantly. What area of the brain might you suspect is not functioning optimally? Provide reasons for your answer. And number 3, what actions would you advise your client to take? Now, this assignment is due this coming Sunday by 11:55 p.m. If you have any difficulty completing this assignment, you may send me a text message or an email. My office hours are on Thursdays from 4 to 6 p.m. And with that, I look forward to receiving your assignments, and I will see you in the next lecture.